now. Okay. So again, thanks all for thanks everybody for being with us. Thanks Olga for being with us. Olga, the floor is yours. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks a lot to you for inviting me, and definitely feel free to interrupt me at any time for questions. And in case there are raised hands that I don't see, feel free to interrupt me, either Dimitrios or whoever is talking, just feel free to step in. So yes, indeed. So I'm very happy to present this paper. This is joint with Kostas Papadopoulos and Dimitrios Xefteris that you probably know. And this is a paper on common ownership. So I understand that basically most of you know what common ownership is, but just in case, it refers to the situation where investors simultaneously hold shares in firms that compete in the same industry, in the same market. And so common ownership has been on the radar of competition economists for a while now, because of the so-called common ownership hypothesis. The idea of the hypothesis is that if the firms or the managers of a firm care about maximizing the value of shareholders, but shareholders not only have shares in the firm, but also have shares in the competitors of this firm, to some extent, the manager of the firm will take into account the profits of these other competitors in the objective of the firm. And this, of course, would lead to a softening of competition and eventually to an anti-competitive outcome. So this idea is not new, right? It goes back to the 80s at least, but it has recently been the object of a renewed great deal of attention in relationship with the enormous growth of institutional investors. And why was this the case? Was the case because institutional investors, so you know, like big funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, and so on. So these investors are extremely diversified. Sometimes they hold industry-wide portfolio, so they have shares in all of the companies in the same industry. And in this case, if the common ownership hypothesis is true, so the prediction would be particularly concerning, because the prediction would be that common ownership would lead to an industry-wide monopoly in the worst case scenario. So indeed, in the last years, there has been a large deal of research, theoretical and mostly empirical, on the potential anti-competitive effects of common ownership. But competition authorities, so both in the US and in Europe, have been so far quite reluctant to take regulatory action. And the main argument for that has been that the mechanism of influence, so the mechanism of harm of common ownership, is not yet clear. So what is crucial but not yet clear is whether and to what extent can common owners influence the choices of the manager. So it can have influence on the objective of the firm. So this is not clear. So it would be maybe a more straightforward issue if common owners were majority or controlling shareholders of companies. But this is typically not the case. So in this table, so this is a snapshot from a table from a paper by Schmaltz of 2018, and it's showing the top shareholders of the biggest airlines companies in the US. So if you see institutional investors such as, for example, the big three, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, you can see that they have shares in all of the companies. But in all of the cases, the shares are relatively small, so very far from being controlling and definitely far from being majority, okay? So how is possible that shareholders that are non-controlling or very far from being controlling impose their preferences over the management, over the objective of the firm? So of course, they are diversified shareholders, so they would like the manager of the firm to maximize something that is close to industry profit, because industry profit will be something that is close to the value of their portfolio if they are very diversified. But the point is that they are not alone in the firm. So in the firm, there will be other shareholders that are less diversified than them, or even not diversified. And these shareholders will have very different preferences about what the objective of the firm should be. In particular, if they are not diversified or almost not diversified, they will want the manager of the firm to just maximize the own profits of the firm. Okay, so since in the firm there will typically be shareholders that have very different degrees of diversification, and these shareholders will have therefore very different preferences about what the objective of the firm should be, the determination of the objective of the firm is a collective choice problem. Okay, so what we want to do in the paper is to study this collective choice problem. And we show that what matters for these anti-competitive effects to emerge is not whether common owners are individually big, but the only thing that matters is that they collectively have the majority of the shares of the firms. Okay, so while the literature has focused on the role of relatively large common owners and they has neglected the role of small diversified shareholders, we are concluding that actually the role of so that small shareholders can have a relevant role as well. So the only thing that matters is the collective size. So in this sense, we argue that common ownership can be a bigger problem than what is believed so far. So what has the literature done or not done? So the literature has, of course, acknowledged the presence of this collective choice problem, but it has, to some extent, neglected it in the sense that it has used a reduced form approach. So what is this reduced form approach? Is that it is assumed that the manager of the firm maximizes a control-weighted sum of the portfolios of firm shareholders. What does it mean? It means that the higher the stake that a shareholder has in the firm, the larger weight will this firm give to the portfolio of this shareholder. So these weights are exogenous, they are given, and are increasing in the stake of the shareholder in the firm. Okay, so and as has been acknowledged already by a number of authors, this approach can be problematic in the sense that it tends to overweight the importance of large shareholders, and it tends to underweight the role of small shareholders, regardless of the overall ownership structure of the firm. I'm going to show you an example in a minute, but this can be problematic in the case where there are groups of shareholders with different preferences. So in our case, more diversified and less diversified, if the size of the shareholders in one of the group is systematically smaller than the size of the shareholders in the other group, because typically the weight of the shareholders that are smaller is much less than the ones of the shareholders that are bigger, even if the group of the small shareholders collectively has the majority of the shares. So just to clarify things, let me show you this very simple example. So consider case one, and consider that the firm is owned by only two shareholders. The first shareholder has 95% of the shares of the firm and is diversified, okay? And the second shareholder has 5% of the shares of the firm is undiversified. So what the standard approach would predict in this case is that this diversified shareholder has a much larger weight than the undiversified one. So the firm will, so basically let's say the firm will take into account only the preferences or mostly the preferences of this diversified shareholder, and therefore the objective of the firm will be something that is close to industry profit maximization, so which is the maximization of the portfolio of this diversified shareholder. And this is fine, this is non-problematic because it's consistent with the majority rule. Then let's go to the second case. In the second case, everything is identical, with the only difference that the ownership of the diversified shareholder is split, so is fragmented in a number of very large number of very small shareholders. These shareholders have exactly the same preferences of the large shareholder here. It's just that the ownership is fragmented, okay, while nothing happened to the undiversified shareholder. So what the standard approach will predict here is that individually, these very, very small shareholders, they will have zero relevance, zero weight, which means that also collectively they will have neglectable weight and definitely less weight than the undiversified shareholder. Okay, so in this case, therefore, the only preferences that will be reflected in equilibrium, that will be taken into account by the firm, are the ones of this undiversified shareholder. Therefore, the firm will maximize the own profit of the firms, despite the extremely large majority of shareholders would have different preferences. Okay, so this is inconsistent with the majority rule. So basically, the standard approach is fine as long as shareholders are relatively large, but it can be problematic when shareholders are small. Okay, so this, as I mentioned before, this problem of inconsistency with the majority rule has been acknowledged by a number of authors, and probably also because of this problem, the literature has mostly focused on the case where common owners are controlling shareholders or are sufficiently large shareholders, because in this case, there is no problem of inconsistency with the majority voting. And you might think this is not a problem, right? Because it's true that big shareholders or larger shareholders have disproportionately more voting power than small shareholders, because they have higher stakes in the voting process, right? So they are more engaged in the voting process, while small shareholders they have small stakes, they don't care about going to participate in voting and so on. But first of all, it seems like a stretch that small shareholders, the collective voting power of small shareholders will be zero when small shareholders have the large majority of the shares. So this would already theoretically seem a stretch. But more than that, there is evidence that instead the votes of small shareholders count. So there is quite some literature from corporate finance showing that there are multiple ways such that small shareholders can make their vote count. For example, it's reported the role of these so-called gadfly shareholders. So these are very small shareholders. Sometimes it can be an individual person that is very active and very vocal and manages to engage fellow shareholders to participate in the voting process, especially on some type of managerial decisions, or the role of shareholders associations that help small shareholders to coordinate their voting decisions and therefore to make their voting count. And last, another problem with neglecting small shareholders is that policy implications can be ungranted, because so the idea is that if we forget about small shareholders, then if small shareholders are not important, then in order to reduce this anti-competitive threat that comes from common ownership, the only thing that we need to do is to make large shareholders small or sufficiently small. And indeed, this is the idea behind some of the current policy proposals from the US. So that, for example, they want to put a cap on individual shareholdings by institutional investors, or, for example, this pass-through voting reform where individual investors are allowed to directly vote instead of delegating their voting power to the fund, and so on. However, so these proposals are not granted, right? Because actually the role of small shareholders was not properly investigated, especially the collective power of small shareholders was not considered in the literature. So these proposals are not for granted. So what we are doing in the paper is to address these shortcomings from the standard approach, right? So what we propose an alternative method to study the collective choice problem, that study the problem from scratch. So in a setting where shareholders of any size, small and large, and shareholders with any preferences, so diversified, not diversified to any degree, they have a role. So they have a role, and so shareholders just vote in a standard majoritarian setting, which is, so the standard majoritarian voting is the standard voting practice for most corporate decisions. So this is the setting, and what is the mechanism of harm, if you want, what is the mechanism of influence that we propose? We propose a mechanism based on voting for managers, in the sense that shareholders will vote for managers that, once elected, will compete à la Cournot. And managers differ in what we call their social concern. What is their social concern? Is their aversion to the negative externality of production. For example, you can think about environmental impact or other negative externalities from production. And so if a manager is socially concerned, it means that he has an extra cost from production. So it's a private cost that comes from the externality that is not internalized by the company. So what this will imply is that so managers that are socially concerned will want to distort output downward relative to the profit maximizing level, but because they want to reduce the negative externality of production, but by doing so, they will also reduce the negative externality that they have on the rival company. Therefore, this will soften competition and will increase industry profits. Then, diversified shareholders that want to maximize something that is close to industry profit, so their portfolio will be something close to industry profit, will want to vote for socially concerned managers, because these managers are distorting the market outcome exactly in that direction. If instead they are not sufficiently diversified, they will vote for a manager that doesn't have any concern, because this type of manager will stick to own profit maximization. So there will be different preferences in the firms of which type of manager should be elected, but this agreement will just be solved by majority voting. And so if the majority of the shares in the firm is held by sufficiently diversified shareholders, in equilibrium, a socially concerned manager will be elected, and in equilibrium, there will be an anti-competitive outcome. If the majority of the shares is not held by sufficiently diversified shareholders, a normal manager, if you want, will be elected, and therefore there will be no anti-competitive outcome in equilibrium. So our approach manages to fix, if you want, this inconsistency that is happening in the standard approach, in the sense that something can happen in equilibrium that is inconsistent with the majority rule. If we go back to the example of before, you remember where collectively this set of very small diversified shareholders could not have any role in the choice of the firm. In our setting, what happens is that so the large majority of the shares and therefore of the votes is held by this very small, very large number of very small diversified shareholders. So all of these shareholders will vote for a socially concerned manager. Collectively, they have the large majority of the shares. So in equilibrium, a socially concerned manager will be elected. And therefore, this manager will take a decision that will lead to industry profit maximization, which is exactly the objective that the majority of the shareholders want. And so this is consistent with the majority rule. And the last result is that we also consider endogenous ownership. So we also consider the case of what would happen if, starting from a benchmark where there is no common ownership, so where all shareholders are undiversified, what would happen if we let them freely choose their degree of diversification, and we find that common ownership will emerge in equilibrium. Actually, full diversification will happen in equilibrium. And this will lead to the monopolistic outcome, so the worst possible outcome, And in terms of policy implications, I mean, already mentioned before, but what we find is that while the focus so far has been on large shareholders as a possible source of anti-competitive effects, also small shareholders can be a problem as long as they have collectively the majority of the shares of the firm, and even in presence of undiversified blockholders. So they don't need to. So being big, if you want, is neither necessary nor sufficient for these anti-competitive effects to emerge. So the only thing that matters is to have the majority of the shares of the firm, and the individual size does not matter. Therefore, again, so all proposals that are based on making big shareholders small might not be sufficient as a solution because of what I've said so far. And so to conclude on this part, so I told you already, I mean, the most important contribution of the paper is to propose this alternative approach to solve the collective choice problem that is consistent with the majority rule, with the standard majority voting rule. Another thing that I want to mention is that most of the papers in the literature consider a direct mechanism, in the sense that the shareholders can directly influence the manager, or the manager directly takes into account in its objective the portfolio preferences of the shareholders. However, the extent to which this can happen in reality might be constrained by, I don't know, agency problems, or even legal constraints. So it seems important also to investigate indirect mechanism. And as far as we know, the only paper that has considered, that has studied the indirect mechanism is this paper recently, this paper by Anton and co-authors recently published in Journal of Political Economy. And they consider as an indirect mechanism the design of contracts for the manager, so low-powered contracts for managers, and we consider a different mechanism based on voting for managers. And last, in our results suggest that a higher degree of common ownership will be associated with larger presence in the economy of managers with social responsibility concern, without the need of any regulation. So in this sense, our paper contribute to this recent literature on the bright side of common ownership. So this was a long introduction, but the most important thing here is to convince you that there is actually a need for an alternative approach to the one proposed by the literature. But the model is, I think, is the simplest model that we can think of to solve the problem that you are interested about.
Olga, may I make a couple of questions?
Totally.
Okay, very interesting, the approach, of course, but I was trying to understand, I mean, this problem that you mentioned stays the same in my paper with Moreno, because I think it is not, at least maybe it's the same thing, but in a much lighter way. Yeah? So you know the paper, the Moreno and Petraik's economic letters.
Well, maybe you can remind me. I'm sure I had a look, but I don't remember exactly what.
Because there we have small shareholders,
and
we have some large shareholders. So the manager takes into account both the small shareholders and the large shareholders, and then this introduces these lambdas, the famous lambdas. But these lambdas depend on the number of the large shareholders, of their portfolio diversification, and also on the number of the small shareholders.
Okay, but so the point is that if a group, let's say, so if the group of the diversified shareholders has the majority, so if so if the dominant preference is the one by diversified shareholders, the undiversified shareholders should have zero impact in equilibrium. because in order for this thing to be consistent with the majority principle, the group that doesn't have the majority, the preferences of the group that doesn't have the majority should not matter in equilibrium. So the standard approach is giving more weight to shareholders that are bigger. So in theory, this is non-consistent with the majority principle, because the majority principle will predict that only the preferences of the group that as the majority should matter.
Yeah, but I mean, if you have small shareholders, some of them are not going to vote, or they do not participate. So they have a weight, of course. But I mean, you cannot say that if there are 51% of small shareholders, then they are going to determine the outcome.
No, totally. No, you're totally right. That's why I was saying. So I think we should consider what is the upper bound of the problem here. So you want to allow for a setting where the worst case scenario coming from the small shareholders is taken into account. Maybe I will put it more this way. And we have, I was mentioned before that there is evidence that small shareholders can always coordinate their vote. And I think, so the extreme case that we have to think about is the case where small shareholders collectively have a very large majority of the shares. Say, we're not talking about 51, but we're talking about 90, 95, or even more. So, okay, maybe it's an extreme case, but if we want to look at the upper bound of the problem, probably we should consider what happens even in this case. So we are arguing that if small shareholders collectively have a very large majority of the shares, they would likely find a way to make their vote collectively count. Yeah,
okay. And another thing that, I mean, why do you need this socially concerned manager? I mean, I understand that it works mathematically, but maybe there's some other mechanism which is not called socially concerned, and you get the same result.
Yes, no, this you are right. So what will matter in equilibrium is anything that determines the objective of the firm. So you can even think about directly voting on the objective of the firm, or you can think about something similar to the paper by Anton et al. So basically designing the incentives for the manager and so on and so forth. I think, but we had to choose something to investigate this formally. And so we decided to go for the type of the manager, but the results will be basically the same with any other similar modelization.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good. Yeah. I think it's kind of extreme assumption there, and you don't need this assumption to get the same result, I believe.
Yeah, thank you. Also other people told us, yeah, you are right. I mean, we'll see whether we can make it more general. But yeah, exactly. So you can think about anything that's somehow related to the objective of the firms. Anyhow, okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? So if not, I will explain you the model. So exactly, so we have a very simple duopolistic industry. So there are two publicly listed firms that sell homogeneous good. The inverse demand is linear, very simple. Production cost normalized to zero. So in this setting, this is the profit function of the firm. There is a set of shareholders, can be very large or not, any size. And each shareholder K is characterized by a portfolio. Each component of the portfolio is a percentage of the total shares that shareholder K has in each of the firms. And there is no constraint on the relative or the absolute size of this. So any size of shareholding is allowed, any degree of diversification of the portfolio is allowed. We only assume that the shareholder has to have shares in at least one of the firms. Shareholders only want to maximize the value of the portfolio. The value of the portfolio is simply a weighted average of the profits of the two firms. where of course the weights are the shares that the shareholder has in the two firms. Of course, if the shareholder is undiversified, his objective reduces to the profits of the firm he has share in. At the other extreme, if he is symmetrically diversified, so these two shares are similar or equal, he will want to maximize industry profits. And of course, any option in between is allowed. So instead of working with the shares, with the portfolio, we use a more synthetic indicator of the degree of diversification of the portfolio, which we call relative interest. So the relative interest is just the ratio between the shares that a shareholder has in one firm and the sum of the shares that he has overall. 1 second, Luca, and I'll let you speak. And so we call sigma k, the relative interest of shareholder k in firm 1, and 1 minus sigma k, the relative interest in firm 2. And we also, for the following, we will also rank shareholders in increasing order with respect to the relative interest in firm 1, which will automatically mean that they are ranked in decreasing order in the relative interest in firm 2. So Luca, go ahead.
So basically this this share of participation in the company, my understanding is if S1 or 2 is equal to 0, and if S1 is equal to S2, the result should be the same. So what the objective would be monopoly profits, right?
Yes, yes. So sigma. So you're talking about S or sigma? S, right?
S in this moment, yeah.
Yeah. So S. So if one of the two is 0, you're only maximizing the profits of the companies you have share in. Right. So if for example the shareholder K has only shares in firm 2, this term will be equal to 0, and therefore the objective will be to maximize the profits of firm 2. The opposite if he has only S1 and not S2. So then it can, all of these two, both of these two can be positive if they are similar. So I don't know, say 1/3 in both of the cases, 1/3 in both of the cases, the objective would be to maximize the sum of the profits, which would be industry profits. Of course, there can be differences. So if one is smaller, is much smaller relative to the other, the objective would be much closer to the profit maximization of one of the two firms, depending on which one is larger.
Just, I mean, industry profit maximization should lead to monopoly as well, right?
Yes, industry profit maximization is monopoly. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so show you an example. So for example, with 9 shareholders. Let's look at 2 shareholders, green shareholder and red shareholder. So this is portfolio of green shareholder. Green shareholder is undiversified. He has 0% of shares of firm 1 and 13% of the shares of firm 2. His relative interest in firm 1 is 0. Relative interest in firm 2 is 1. And therefore is ranking first in both of these listings. If instead we look at red shareholder is diversified. Actually, it's almost perfectly diversified. So its relative interest is close to 1/2. Okay, and therefore it's ranking halfway around halfway in both listing. So you can think that the closer this sigma k and 1 minus sigma k are to 0 or to 1, the more undiversified the shareholder is. The closer these numbers are close to 1/2, the more diversified the shareholder is. Yes, Daphne, go ahead.
I'm not familiar with this literature, but my question would be, well, of course, how much they own, how much these shareholders own of the company in question. But what is the percentage in terms of their own share holdings or their own capital? I mean, if Berkshire Hathaway owns 100% of a mini market, then it's a different share than holding 50% or 20% of General Motors. What's the importance of this shareholding for the shareholder?
So, I mean, in general, if we think about institutional investors, the one I was mentioning before, they have very few percentage points in each of the company. Then, of course, if you sum them up, it would be very large shareholdings. But what matters here, the only thing that matters here is what is the percentage that they have of the firms they invest into. So you can think about relatively small numbers. That's why here I'm never considering controlling shareholders. So here you can think about relatively small shares, always less than 50%, even less than 30%.
Okay, thanks. I'm still puzzled because
Can I interrupt, Daphne?
Yes.
Basically, this literature builds on the idea that these institutional shareholders hold shares in huge companies. Like the main interest is companies that comprise the S&P 500. So basically, there are no mini markets there. All firms are gigantic, and these people have voice there. So perhaps this.
But the question is whether these shareholdings are important for the company. How important are they for the company in question? Not for the company in which they are holding the shares, but for themselves.
From my understanding of this literature, I cannot say if they are important or not, but they are equally important or unimportant. I don't know if this is informative for you. So because the companies that we are talking about is exactly General Motors, Pfizer, so companies of this size.
Yeah, they're all listed companies. So these are always all listed companies. So quoted companies, and typically an institutional investor would have something that is around 3% of this company. So that's exactly, I think this is actually the point. So it seems that it's not important, 3%. 3% is not important for that company. But the idea here is that if you put together all of the 3% of all the institutional investors, eventually you end up to a number that can be 30%, 50%, or around that. So I think this is the idea, so that individually, these institutional investors have 3% or very individually small share in these companies, but collectively they can reach a large number. Also, this is just a channel. Of course, there are some papers that look at all the possible channels. Of course, institutional investors, they can talk to each other, and they can go at meetings where they basically tell to the managers what the managers have to do. So, but it's a similar mechanism. So it's the collective dimension that matters more than the individual one, I would say.
Okay, I don't want to insist. I will have to think about it by myself. But if the question was, how does this company perform, which has this variety of shareholders, etc., I would understand it better. Then here I understand you're interested in what the Berkshire had, why Berkshire decided to invest in similar companies. So I would like to know how important this is for Berkshire, not for the company in which it holds shares.
Well,
but
Berkshire,
I will have to think about it.
But yeah, I mean, of course, also, I mean, I don't know much, but I mean, I think that so these are called passive investors because they're just investing in the entire S&P index. So they just invest 3% in all of them. So the individual 3% of Vanguard in Delta Airlines maybe is not so important individually, but I mean, if you sum up all of the 3% that Vanguard does in all of these listed companies, it's a lot.
May I say something to Daphne?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are not only these big institutional investors that are very known, supposedly very known to us. But there are also index funds, pension funds, and all of them, they have shares in many firms, not in only one industry, but in many industries. So, I mean, all these index funds are have a portfolio, very diversified portfolio in many sectors, for many firms, etc. So it's very important to know what happens and if this is going to create problems to the competition. And the question is how these firms can influence the managers that are present in the small or large firms everywhere in all the economy. I mean, but I would like to ask you something, Olga. I mean, let's take your example with 9 investors, and suppose that 7 of them are non-diversified, and we have 2 large ones which are fully diversified. What's going to be the result in your model?
So if the large one sum up, the large one not diversified, their shares sum up to at least 50%, then the result would be that there are no anti-competitive effects because the shareholder, the manager type that is selected is not socially concerned and will stick to profit maximization.
So the large investors do not play any role, you mean?
No, the large investor play a role as long as they have the majority of the shares. So if you had so here I will show you later. But I will show you later because of course this is crucial. So what matters here is the numerators of these fractions. Okay, the numerators of these fractions. If the numerator and the shareholders are ranked here in their relative interest in firm 1. Okay. So if you sum up these shares and you and the sum of the shares are reach 50%, and there will be a concept that I didn't explain yet, but will be the one of the median shareholder. So if the median shareholder is the shareholder such that 50% of the shares before him, if like his shares plus the ones the shares of the ones before him are at least 50%. Okay, so more or less it's reflecting the preferences of the majority of the firm. If this median shareholder is undiversified, in equilibrium, a manager that is not socially concerned will be elected. If instead it's diversified or sufficiently diversified, a manager that is socially concerned will be elected. So it all depends on how large are the different shareholders with different preferences. But of course, if the 2 shareholders, one is 35 and the other is 15, of course they will be important for what happens in the majority. I'm just saying that what happens for the equilibrium is the 50%.
Yeah, because my question is because in BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they have more or less 6 to 10% shares in the same firms in many industries, but that does forget about the industry. That's a more complicated issue. Now, they don't have too much. In total, these 3, they have almost less than 30% all the time. And there are supposedly that there are many other small shareholders. What's the prediction of this new model?
So, these 3, let's say these 3, big 3, they do 30%, something around that. Then, if there is no other diversified shareholder in the shareholders of the firm, so basically the diversified shareholders count up to 30% in equilibrium. Socially unconcerned manager is elected because the dominant preferences will be the ones of the undiversified shareholders. If there is no more than this 3.
That's basically my question. But this again extreme. You go to another extreme, which I don't think that is realistic. I mean,
no,
neither the
I
one
don't
nor
know
the
what is
other.
realistic. I'm just saying, we're just saying that we need to focus on the upper bound of the problem if we want to properly investigate what is the role of small shareholders. Also, so now these three these big three are the big three of the institutional investors, but there are other institutional investors. So I'm not sure it's true that collectively they only have 30%. They might reach 50%. Anyhow, the point is that theoretically, the collective side of the problem has not been thoroughly investigated. So this is what we plan to do here.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is empirical, of course. I mean,
yes. I mean, everything is. I mean, there is not so much from the theoretical point of view. So I think that's where our contribution is. Then.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks to you. No, very good comments. So this was about the shareholders, okay? The manager, so production decisions are taken by a manager that is elected. So I will tell you about elections in a moment. And we assume that there is a continuum of manager types that are available for hiring. The manager type is, as mentioned before, is something that we call social concern. Social concern is the aversion to the negative externality of production. You can think about environmental impact. You can think about other negative externality that generates from production and is observable. So managers can go from being not socially concerned, so M equals 0, up to be extremely socially concerned. Again, social concern implies that the managers have this extra private cost. Okay, so they internalize the cost of the externality that is not internalized by the firm. And other than that, so other than this potential cost, which is increasing in their degree of social concern, they only care about profits. So again, differently from the standard approach, the manager doesn't take into account the portfolio preferences of the shareholders, only takes into account the profits, the own profit of the firm, plus this potential cost. So you can see here already that if the manager doesn't have social concern, it will stick to profit maximization. If he has a social concern, he will want to distort output downward relative to the level that maximize profits, and the more so, the more socially concerned is. How does selections for manager work? So shareholder meetings are held in each firm, and managers are elected in these shareholder meetings. However, we assume that shareholders do not participate directly in these meetings, but they delegate this to agents, so proxies, one for each firm. And these proxies, they are independent and they don't communicate to each other. So the reason why we assume this is that I mean, in a sense, it's a conservative for conservative reasons, because we want to exclude that the potential anti-competitive effects of common ownership, they come from direct coordination. So just by the fact that the same shareholder sits in the meetings of both companies, and therefore this would mean this. Of course, if this would be clear coordinator or collusion, whatever you want to call it, and this would directly imply that there is an anti-competitive effect. We want to shut down this direct channel, and therefore, if we will observe anti-competitive effects, this will be due only to the richer incentive structure that common ownership generates. So how do election works? They work in 2 stages. Okay, in the first stage, the agents of the shareholders will propose their ideal manager type. What is the ideal manager type? Is the type of manager that maximizes the portfolio of the shareholder they represent from the perspective of the firm where the agent is. So taking as given the manager that is expected to be elected in the other firm. Okay, so the objective of the 2 agents of the same shareholder is the same, but the perspective is different because they are in 2 different firms. And so once then all agents have proposed their own ideal manager type, all of these proposals are collected, and the agents vote by 1 share, 1 vote majority rule on all of these proposals, and the winner is the manager type that wins, so that collects a majority of votes over each other proposed type. So here is a summary of the timeline. There is first this voting stage in the two sub-stages that I just described. At the end of this voting stage, the manager is elected in each of the two firms, and then the production stage, the elected managers choose takes basically production decisions. So, of course, I told you that the managers compete à la Cournot. So in absence of these social concerns, the result will be the Cournot equilibrium. So the question is, how is the presence of these social concerns impact on the Cournot equilibrium? So you can see this by looking at, so these expressions are the equilibrium levels of output and the equilibrium levels of profits. So as you can see, both the output and the profits are decreasing in the social concern of the manager of the firm, and they are increasing in the social concern of the manager of the rival. So both of these things are intuitive. So why is decreasing in the social concern of the manager of the firm? Because I mean, I showed you already the objective before, but what is the reaction function recommending is that the more socially concerned the manager is, of course, the more he will want to distort downward the output relative to the profit maximizing one, which of course will reduce profits. But so the more socially concerned the manager of the rival firm is, the more will be the rival firm that decreases output, so distorts output downward, and as a standard Cournot reaction function recommends is to increase, of course, to react by increasing output level, which will imply that also profits increase. So if you think about it, the effect of this social concern is analogous to the one that you have in the Cournot with asymmetric cost, where the weakest firm, so the one with the higher cost, reduces output and reduces output, and by doing so is internalizing the externality as on the rival. So the rival will be able to produce more and will have a higher profit, but the net effect will be negative on output. So it will be total output will decrease, equilibrium price will increase, and industry profits will increase. So this is what happens here, the same. So the presence of socially concerned managers will distort the market outcome from Cournot towards monopoly. So will distort the outcome from own profit maximization to industry profit maximization. So then you would think that since diversify shareholders try to maximize something is closer to industry profit maximization, they would want to vote for more socially concerned manager types, while less diversified shareholders, so the ones that prefer something that is closer to own profit maximization, will want to vote for less socially concerned manager types. And this would be a correct guess, with the only twist that shareholders do not directly vote on manager types, because their agents will vote on manager types. Okay, so what we find is that the ideal manager type of an agent in a firm is decreasing in the relative interest of that shareholder in a firm. Okay, so if you think here is firm 1, the shareholder K that the voter is representing, if this shareholder has a sufficiently large shareholding in the firm, so it's larger than 2/3, and therefore its objective is something that is going to be close to profits of firm 1, the ideal manager type of the shareholder is 0. At the other opposite, if the shareholding in firm 1 is relatively small, which automatically means that the shareholding in the rival firm is relatively high, the ideal manager type of the voter in firm 1 is very large, because the only way to advantage firm 2 is by activating this asymmetric mechanism that I was explaining before, by which the manager in this firm reduces a lot the output in this firm and therefore reduces a lot the externality on the other firm. And then there are intermediate values in between. So again, in the context of our example, with the green and red shareholder. So again, green shareholder, for example, you remember this is an undiversified shareholder, only has shares in firm 2. So the objective of this shareholder is to maximize profits in firm 2. How will the two agents of this shareholder vote? So again, the objective of these two shareholders is the same, but of these voters is the same, but the perspective is different because they are in two different firms. So in firm 2, in firm 2, the voter, the ideal manager of the voter in firm 2 is a manager that is not socially concerned, because in this firm, the manager will stick to own profit maximization. On the other hand, the ideal manager type of this voter in firm 1 is to choose a very high, as I was saying before, basically, so a very socially concerned type in order to benefit firm 2 by reducing the externality that firm 1 has on firm 2. The red shareholder instead, red shareholder, you remember, is almost perfectly diversified. So the two agents of this shareholder are more symmetric. So basically, they have very similar perspective, if you want. So both of them will want to choose a socially concerned manager, so that in both firms the output is distorted downward, and the firms can reduce the negative externality they have on each other, so that actually both firms are better off. So this is just to illustrate this how this mechanism work. So in both firms there will be very different preferences on what the objective of the manager should be, or what manager should be elected, right? And this is because in the firms there are very different preferences due to different degrees of diversification of the shareholders. So how is this disagreement on managers solved? Is solved simply by voting by one share, one vote, okay? So, and what we do, we don't have to solve this voting game from scratch. We just need to apply a very standard result, which is the median voter theorem. The median voter theorem is telling us two things. The first one is if voters have, say, well-behaved preferences over manager types, which is something that we have proven. We know that there will be a unique winner in each of the two firms. So we are ensured that there is a unique solution to the voting game in each of the two firms, something that is technically called the Condorcet winner. So there will be a unique winning manager in each of the two firms. And second, that in each of the two firms, the winning manager type will be the ideal manager type of the median voter. So without going too technical, so the median vote, I will show you in the example in 1 second. So the median voter, who is the median voter in each firm, is the agent that represents the median shareholder. So who's the median shareholder? The median shareholder is the shareholder that has at least 50% of the shares and therefore of the votes, including him, at his left. So at his left, meaning all of the shareholders that are ranked before him, when the shareholders are ranked in terms of their relative interest, and at least 50% of the shares and therefore of the votes on his right, including him. Okay, I will show you in 1 second with our example. So once the two median voters are identified, the only preferences that matter in equilibrium in terms of ideal manager types are the ones of the median voters. So once the median voters are identified, the equilibrium choices of managers are the mutually optimal choices of these two median voters. So if you want, the decision reduces to a game between the median voters. Okay, so their choices was optimal given the expectation of what was happening in the other firm. In equilibrium, the expectations are correct. So this will be the two values that are identified. So what does this mean is that it will never happen that in equilibrium, the winning manager is the manager that is not the one wanted by the majority of the firms, because it's the one, it is like voted from the majority of the votes. So the objective of the firm will always be the ones that is preferred by the majority of the shareholders. So if the majority of the shares and therefore of the votes is held by shareholders that are sufficiently diversified, the winning manager will be socially concerned and there will be anti-competitive outcome in equilibrium. If the majority of votes is held by shareholders that are not sufficiently diversified, a manager that doesn't have social concern will be elected, and therefore there will not be an anti-competitive outcome in equilibrium. So in the example, so this is firm one. You see that shareholders are ranked in increasing order with respect to their relative interest in firm one. If you sum up the numerators are the number of shares that the different shareholders have in that firm. You need to reach 50 to know which one is the median voter. And you will see that the median voter is this blue guy here. So yeah, 50% of the shares, including him, on his left, and 50% of the shares, including him, on his right. So this is the median voter. The median voter is relatively undiversified. He has 2/3 of the shares in firm one. So his objective is, his preference is something that is close to profit maximization in firm one. And consistently, the ideal manager of this shareholder is a manager without social concern. In firm two, doing the same thing that I just explained you, the median voter is this red guy. This guy is relatively diversified, actually almost perfectly diversified. And consistently, so his objective is something that is going to be close to industry profit maximization. So his ideal manager type is a socially concerned one. What will be the implications for the market outcomes? So firm two will distort the output downward, which will harm firm two and benefit firm one. So firm one will produce more than Cournot and get higher profit than Cournot. Firm two will produce less than Cournot and get lower profit than Cournot. But the overall outcome will be worse than Cournot. So total quantity lower than Cournot, industry profits larger than Cournot. So exactly, so in one firm, it's efficient actually that in one firm, a socially concerned manager is elected for this anti-competitive mechanism to be at play. So I've illustrated results mostly with this example. Of course, we also have general results in the paper. Also, I focus mostly on this asymmetric case where different types of managers are elected in the two firms and where basically one firm benefits at the expense of the other. But we also show that a symmetric case is possible where the same type of manager is elected in the two companies and where both companies are better off. So it's not the case that one is better off at the expense of the other. And so now I think I have very little time left, but I also want to quickly tell you about the case of endogenous ownership. So the idea is that so far we have considered exogenous ownership structure, but what is interesting to see is strategic shareholders, in the sense how would the shareholders strategically choose their shareholdings. Why? Because they know that the shareholdings will influence the choice of the managers, and they know that the choice of the manager will influence the market outcome. So strategic shareholders could, if you want, to manipulate their own shareholding choices to influence the market outcome. So in order to investigate this question, we introduce an extra stage before the voting stage, which we call the trading stage, where shareholders can trade the shares. And we assume that at the beginning they are undiversified. So at the beginning there is no common ownership. And we consider this simple case where there are only 2 shareholders and 2 firms. So initial undiversified shareholder means that each of them only own shares in one of the firm. Actually, they own all of the shares in one of the firm. And then we consider both a barter economy and a competitive market. And in both cases, we show that in equilibrium, it can happen not all in equilibrium, they will trade shares. And also one of the equilibrium is that they will trade shares until they reach full diversification. So basically they exchange half of the firm, okay, so that they both reach a full diversification, which means that their objective for both of them, they will have an identical objective, which is exactly equal to profit maximization, industry profit maximization. And therefore we'll choose a manager type that is sufficiently high, so 1 is sufficiently high. And this will lead to the monopoly outcome. So basically the collusion outcome where each of the 2 firms produce half of the monopoly profit and produces half of the monopoly output and get half of the monopoly profit. So the worst possible outcome. So I think I can conclude and then we can have more questions. So what we've done in this paper, we have proposed an alternative approach to study the collective choice problem of shareholders in a setting where shareholders of any size, so big, not only big, but also small, can have a role, and where shareholders with any preference, so any degree of diversification can play a role. And where the importance of the role is determined by their votes, the votes they have in the voting process, and the number of votes is equal to the number of shares they have. And we think we have confirmed the anti-competitive results that have been found in the literature, but we have added some novel insights. So we think, so the first one is that for these anti-competitive effects to emerge, shareholders do not need to be individually big. They can also be individually small. What we think is crucial is the collective size of their shares. So if small shareholders collectively, small diversified shareholders collectively hold the majority of the shares of the firm, we will observe anti-competitive effects in equilibrium. Otherwise, we will not. And second, in order for these anti-competitive effects to emerge, it's not the case that shareholders need to have a direct influence on managerial choices. We have shown that an indirect mechanism based on voting for managers that can be socially concerned can provide, for example, an indirect mechanism for this anti-competitive effect to emerge. And last, we have shown that even starting from an initial situation where there is no common ownership, so where all shareholders are undiversified, and allowing them to freely choose the diversity of their portfolio would lead to common ownership in equilibrium, and actually to the worst market outcome, because there will be full diversification, which leads to monopoly. And finally, the policy implication of our results is that the role of small shareholders should not be neglected, right? And especially when it comes to their collective aspect, and therefore policy proposals that are focused on making big shareholders small should probably be reassessed or reconsidered in light of our results. And with this, I would conclude, and happy to take more questions.
Okay, thank you, Olga, for this interesting presentation. Yeah, so questions from the audience, comments, anything you want to ask or comment on?
Yeah, I can comment more.
Yes,
Yeah, go
I
on.
like your comments. This is great. I will also
Let me say, first of all, the endogenous ownership in the example that you mentioned is similar to the spirit in the paper of Moreno and Petrai's 2021 in Economic Letters. because there the stable equilibrium is full diversification portfolio of the large shareholders. But in that paper, there are also infinitesimal shareholders, which are not present in your case. However, there is an internal critique of your approach from Dimitris Xefteris, because Dimitris Xefteris has a very nice paper, as you know, where there is the weighted voting model.
Yes,
And
I'm aware.
this weighting voting model is very interesting in this case, because the small shareholders cannot have the same information as the large ones. In this sense, if you use the approach of the other paper of Dimitris, then obviously you get in some situations where the small shareholders do not have the same voting power as the large ones. And then the whole thing somewhere goes in some direction, which is somewhere in the middle of what happens in the literature and what happens in your model. So I think this is very important. And of course, I like the paper of Dimitris that with the weighted voting, and we're working on that, not together, but with the department on this issue. And but anyway, I think you should look at this paper. Kostas knows this paper.
No, but I'm aware of the paper. But of course, I mean, if we think that small shareholders, are not relevant, the standard approach of the literature is fine, because I mean, the standard approach in the literature is just saying that yes, we can neglect the role of small shareholders. Their vote is
no, you don't neglect it. You don't neglect it in the paper with my paper. We don't neglect it.
Yes, less important. I mean, it's like simply the large shareholders have more voting power, which I mean, this is what seems to have sense, but I think it's still useful to provide a framework where you consider the full. I mean, if we assume that the voting power of small shareholders count as much as the one of big shareholders, which maybe is reasonable in those cases where the small shareholders collectively have the large majority of the shares, which I think there are some circumstances where this can happen. So since the anti-competitive effects can be very, very concerning, it's good to understand when this can happen. And your other point, the one on infinitesimal shareholders, I mean, I didn't show it in the presentation, but the same situation that we have here, you could have more. You could have instead of. I mean, you can have the starting point, but with more shareholders, and you can have that each start with a share, an infinitesimal share, and you would still obtain full diversification. Instead of being 1/2, you would have 1 over the size of the shareholders.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, but if you have infinitesimal shareholders, and then there is in my paper, you don't end up with monopoly. You end up with a situation where it goes towards monopoly, but if there are many large shareholders who are not controlling in total, then you end up with a situation which is very far from the monopoly. If you have just one large shareholder, then you go closer to the monopoly, closer to lambdas that are larger than half. But if you have more than one, then these lambdas go down and down.
No, I think it's similar. Do you know this other paper by Brito and co-authors? I think they probably do something similar. So they try to make the standard approach a bit more consistent with the majority principle.
Okay.
Okay, but anyhow, thanks. I will also look better at your paper. But anyhow, for sure, Kostas. I mean, for sure we quoted it, and I'm sure Kostas knows it very well. So.
Good. Okay, very nice presentation anyway,
Thank
because this problem is not has not been resolved so far. I'm aware of that. There are problems everywhere, and this is a very important problem to see how the managers act when there are big and small shareholders. So in this sense, the paper makes an important contribution.
Thank you.
Somebody else?
Luca.
Yeah, Luca, it's your turn.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I agree. It's I can see the step forward to some extent, and following those steps, I'm a little bit I'm interested in asking this possible, like, not really extension, but what happens if we go even further in the details of how managers are elected by shareholders. And if we think about it, in reality, for public company at least, there should be an intermediate body, the board of directors. So the shareholders nominates the directors, who are usually independent directors, in particular if the company is very large. And the director then elected the managers. So the common ownership problem, so the fact that the electing body has shares in other firms seems to disappear at this level. And that is kind of the problem with the common ownership dilemma. No, is it really anti-competitive, or is it just a theory which we cannot prove? So I was wondering if you have any idea of what would happen if we introduce an intermediate body between the shareholders and the manager.
So, I mean, yes, good point. So, in general, yes, I mean, especially in big firms, let's say the hierarchy of decisions is more complex. So, for example, this paper by Anton and Cotters that was mentioned before, indeed they have that so whoever is taking pricing decision is a separate agent, for example, from managers, and the idea is that the mechanism can be very indirect somehow. So because in their paper, for example, the shareholders, they design these managerial compensation schemes, which would basically make the managers be more slack, so simply not taking a sufficient level of productivity enhancing effort, and this would have a very indirect influence on in the end production decisions. So in the end, it is not a matter of I don't know, it's not a matter of direct control, but it's a matter of what happens in between. Then there is this other paper by Shekita or Shekita, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is a non-formal one, where he lists, this is actually a very interesting paper, where he lists all of the possible potential indirect mechanisms by which this can happen. And I mean, there are very interesting, extremely indirect mechanisms that can give rise to similar outcomes. As far as I know, it happens also that, especially in this world of the big quoted companies, there are sometimes some events, some networking events where there are the directors of the maybe also these independent directors. I mean, I'm not sure which type of profile these people are, but basically it would be an event, a dinner or something, where there would be the top managers and the top shareholders and independent directors, and there would be people talking and basically telling the managers what they have to do. Maybe not directly, but they would make a statement about something, and the managers would take this as a signal on what they have to do. So I think, I mean, the hierarchy can be more complicated, but the messages can go through the hierarchy, and the effect can be the same. So I'm not sure it's enough if you have intermediate levels of the hierarchy for this to be less of a problem.
But I see your point. So yeah, no, that's true. That it might actually there might be informal situation in which this hierarchy is overturned. So I see the point.
Many things can be informal in the sense I know about these events, or I know just about phone calls. So there will be simply phone calls. I mean, these people in the end are the shareholders are very important. So we were saying before 3% maybe doesn't matter, but it does matter. So because they are the same owners of the 3% in all of the industry. So somehow they have they can have many channels to make their preferences count. But anyhow, I took note of this. I mean, I will look better also at this role of the independent directors. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Panagiotis, I think you are next.
Yeah, thank you. So, Olga, I really enjoyed your presentation. I've got a comment, let's say, regarding endogenous ownership. You know, there's that seminal paper of Reynolds and Snap back in 1986 in IJIO. And that paper has a quite interesting result that if you've got n number of firms, then if each one firm owns 1/n of the other firm, then we end up in monopoly equilibrium. So your endogenous ownership result is similar to the result of Reynolds and Snap, because you know you've got two firms. Each firm has half of the other firm. So the way I see it, you know, your pre-stage doesn't actually add much, because at the end of the day, firms would turn to the monopoly equilibrium. If you let them freely trade shares, they will trade 1/n of the shares. N is the number of firms, and they will end up in monopoly equilibrium, monopoly outcome, because this is the best thing they could do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know this paper. I don't think we mentioned this paper. I will double check. But yeah, I mean, I guess, so, I mean, the literature in general also finds this monopoly result. I think the difference here is that we show how this monopoly result can happen, in the sense that it doesn't matter the size of the individual shareholders, but the bottom line that we find also the monopoly outcome is similar. But anyhow, I will have, thank you. I will have a double look at this paper and to make sure to discuss better what is our contribution relative to that.
I'm sure that Kostas knows that paper. You know, your result is pretty close to that result, to the result of that paper.
No, but I think we didn't, I mean, I'm checking now, but then we didn't mention it, so we should probably include it. So
Okay,
thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, what Panagiotis said basically is that if you consider only all shareholders to have some power, then in the end, if you allow them to do this, you know, via competitive market interchange of shares, then you're going to end up all the time in a monopoly equilibrium, which is not empirically relevant. Huh? It's not that the case. I mean, so there, of course, what you have to make sure is, the basics of the model, because you give solutions to one direction and then there are problems in another direction, no? Because this endogenous ownership is very important.
Yeah.
Manoli, if you always have, you know, identical owners, then I claim that you always going to end up in monopoly outcome. You have somehow to differentiate the portfolio.
In this model.
Yeah, in this model. Yeah.
In this model, yes. That's because you don't need only two. You could have many of them, and big and large ones. The result is gonna be the same.
Yes, this totally. This for sure. I mean, I told you I showed you only the one with two, but it's the same if they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter the number, you know, as
No,
long as they are not differentiated, they don't have differentiated portfolios, they have the same preferences.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter the ownership structure of each firm. You
Exactly.
always going to end up each firm
Yeah,
have
yeah.
1/10 of the other firm.
Yeah. No, but thank you.
Do we have more comments, more questions? Okay, if I can ask a couple of things very quickly.
Sure.
It seems to me that first of all, thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. Your paper became much clearer to me thanks to the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
So if I understand well, there is this pool of managers that I can consider for hiring, right?
Yes.
And you assume basically that there are as many managers as I might want, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I was wondering if there is perhaps competition for a specific kind of manager. So there is one guy with a huge M and the companies need to go and get that guy, because if that guy gets a position in another firm, then this person is out of the market and we need to hire somebody else that does not have the M that we want. How would that affect our behavior? Again, this is not something that is relevant for your work, I guess, but in the real world, perhaps, you know, there are 10 people for a specific position, and if we wait too long, then they might be employed elsewhere, and then we will miss some of the good candidates, and we end up with the so-and-so ones. So I was wondering, like, if this would affect the order of the firms hiring the people, like, perhaps the shareholders want some of the firms to be the first hires and to do to hire the right manager first, and then there are firms that should do it second, and so on and so forth, up until the managers are all hired or something. But this is something not relevant for what you do.
Good,
but
good question. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I would not know. I think, I mean, exactly for our paper, it's probably not so important, because it's enough to think about what could be all the different objectives of the firm directly without actually going through this manager. But I mean, I will have to think about this.
Perhaps this is more labor economics question. It seems to me that there is a small part of this literature that actually discusses the effect of common ownership on labor, in the sense that if there are 10 people out there that I can hire, but and I care about you and you care about me, then perhaps we don't give them the best salary that we can give them. We give them a bit less because okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? I don't hire the good person, but this person eventually ends up in your firm, which is okay still, since I have a lambda in your firm. So in any case, this is a question, I guess, for the labor economics people.
Well, maybe I mean, I think, I think there is some I mean, this paper by Anton is related to this, that in the end, we want to hire a bad manager, or you want to make a bad contract for the manager. So it's not super incentivized. So, I mean, related to your question, it might be that competition on managers is not too much of a problem if they have to take, if you want bad managers.
Perhaps we hire the lazy managers first. Which is
that's interesting.
And the second point I wanted to make was about this social concern thing that you have in the paper. Manolis already commented on that. I just wanted to ask if you expect this to have effects in things that you don't discuss. So, for instance, if I understand well, your Purnod game takes place once and that's it. Is that correct? You don't have a flow of profits.
No. Okay. One stage, one shot,
Because I was wondering if this is relevant for what you were saying in the very beginning about the environmental effect of production. So if I am very a socially concerned manager, this means that I discount the future a bit different from other managers. And I was wondering if this eventually affects the intention of the shareholders to elect me over another manager. So perhaps if you study multi-period production, the fact that a socially concerned manager discounts future in a different way can potentially affect some decisions and not others.
Well,
But
yeah,
again, this is not something that you discuss, so I'm just trying to understand what this social concern can reflect to.
Yeah. So I mean, all this social concern / environmental part, I think is super reduced form in the model, in the sense that, I mean, other people had other comments. So for example, I mean, social concern could be that you actually invest in a technology that reduces the negative externality of production. So I mean, this this is another thing, or the thing that you say about discounting. So if you put these things in the picture, of course, we could have different results. So in our case, social concern just means that you don't change anything about the environmental performance of the firm that is not reducing production. So of course, I mean, from my knowledge, I mean, you have two main ways to improve the environmental performance of a firm. One is to reduce the amount of production if you stick to the polluting technology, and the other one is to change the technology and to have a green one, and therefore you don't have to reduce production anymore. So in our case, we only focus on reduction of production.
Okay, that's
but
great.
in principle, I mean, in principle, it can be much more, could be richer. Could be richer this social concern part. So it's like it's just I think a name that we found for this very basic.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Somebody else, follow-up, comments, questions? I know it's already a bit late, but yeah, if you have points to make, now it's the time. If there are no more questions, no more comments, let's thank again our presenter for today.
Thanks a lot to you and for the discussion. It was many useful comments.
Thanks to people in the audience for the discussion. Our seminar series continues next week with a paper again about corporate government, let's say, in microeconomics more generally. So Olga, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks to you.
I stop the recording now.